The next speaker is Dr. Arnagretta, who's with the ANU College of Health and Medicine. And Arnagretta shared some insights with a range of ACT women last week in my office in a small forum we held about women, climate and health, and talked about her work, about the challenges ahead and about the benefits of doing something now and urgently. Arnagretta is a physician and cardiologist. Some of you will know her and know her work, with many years of experience in medicine. She approaches health across a broad context. I'll go on. From the basis of human biology into the social determinants of health and broader environmental context in our lives. So Arnagretta is our final speaker, then we'll come to the panel. So start thinking of your questions, folks.
We had a fantastic event on Friday. Kate was quite determined that we wouldn't give her a farewell event, but I thought we had to mark the extraordinary work she's given Canberra and the community locally. Her work as the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainability. I've been really thank you again. Look, this might be the first time that many of you have heard a practicing doctor speak about climate change, and I would hope that it's not the last time. But I think my job for today was to discuss some of the ways in which climate change is affecting our health, something that's probably much more real for many of us after this summer than it was previously. And so that'll be the starting point, is that whilst people have made extraordinary research in this and the landmark researcher in the field of climate change and health, of course, was Tony McMichael, the heritage of which continues here at ANU. But we really started to understand the effect that climate change will have on our human health over the last few years. And it was in 2015 that the World Health Organization took this argument to the COP21 meeting, saying that climate change is the greatest threat to global health that we are facing in the 21st century. And so that particular call's been used as a carry-on unifying message for many health organisations around the world, and the momentum for health organisations to act on climate change has grown from that. And I think we're seeing it continue to grow today. So how does climate change affect our health? Well, we've already heard from the scientists that our global warming means that we've got a slow increase in the temperature, but that's really not how we're seeing it live through in our lives. What we're seeing is not constant change, but we're experiencing changes in weather, and particularly an increase in extreme weather events, such as, how many have we had this year? Heat waves, floods, fires, storms, and I haven't put hail on that list. But the health effects of our environment are really quite fascinating. And what astounds me as I learn more and more in this field is the extraordinary interrelationship between human health and the environment around us. And I think we've probably underappreciated the importance of the environment. Our focus in medical training, in medical education, and for those who are currently medical students or training as doctors, our focus has always been on the biology of health, and as it should be. And we've increasingly understood that the social determinants might be helpful, but environment has usually been excluded, although it may be touched on in passing. Last year at some point I came up with an idea of tying together the way in which the environment affects our health, and it's relatively simplistic, but I find it easier to remember. Climate change affects our health through three things. It affects the air that we breathe, it affects the food that we eat, and it affects the water with which we wash our hands. Now, these three elements are central, aren't they? Human health and well-being. All three elements are compromised by the environmental degradation, the changes to climate that we see, and these are three really strong reasons why climate action is needed. So, when we go to the hospital environment, do we see climate change affecting our health and well-being? Well, we do, and the more we look for it, the more we will see it. You see climate change and temperature variability affect obstetrics and fertility, and so air pollution and heat waves both have an effect on the likelihood of adverse outcomes during pregnancy. High temperatures often affect male fertility. We know that climate change is affecting childhood, and for anyone in the room with children who are still developing, that the summer we've just had influences their development. We know it affects emergency medicine through extreme weather events, and I'm struck that in the 2003 fires, of course, there were many more people presenting to emergency from trauma, particularly falling off roofs in preparation for the fire, than from the fire itself. And so it can present in interesting ways. Orthopaedics, similarly, through changed patterns of exercise. In general medicine, where I spend some of my time, we look after patients who are at all sorts of ends of the spectrum, and particularly it reminds me all the time that climate change reinforces the pre-existing disparity in health equity across our population. So those who are the most vulnerable will see the health effects of climate change most intensely. We see it in cardiology, and I'm a cardiologist, and we know that particularly hazardous air pollution and temperature variation can influence rates of myocardial infarction and stroke and arrhythmias and all sorts of interesting things. The more we look for it, the more we find. It influences the way our lungs work, and Mark's already commented on that. I think geriatrics and ageing is actually where we probably see it the most, and I'm inclined to think it's general medicine, but it's probably in geriatrics. And I think that's an interesting narrative, because we've always thought that climate action is about looking after the grandchildren or the children. We're worried about the future generations. But again, this summer, maybe last summer, and maybe the last 5 years has shown us that it's not about future generations, it's actually about the life that we live now. And so for those of us who are in our middle ages and older, people who are hoping to enjoy retirement, climate change will affect your health over that period, and we should begin to talk about it. So this summer of 2019-2020 has been a lesson, I think, in climate change and health. We've seen three particular things that I'm going to touch on briefly. We've seen problems with heat, we've seen fire, and we've seen smoke. And so all three elements have significant effects on our health. This is about defining heat. So heat is not just about a particular temperature. We can't say 35 degrees has a problem for our health, but it's the variables of both temperature and humidity that affect our well-being. And so we prefer a temperature that's around 36.8 degrees. And so if it's hotter or colder, we need to do something in order to facilitate that. But this chart on the side is the heat stress index, and it reminds us that lower temperatures with higher humidity can actually be very dangerous as well. So heat, the average summer temperature, and Mark, I should have got the update from you on this number, but in the last 20 years, Australian summer temperatures have increased by 1.66 degrees. And so our hotter, it's not just the average yearly temperature that's risen, but our summers are definitely hotter. Heat is the natural disaster that has the greatest effect on mortality in Australia. So the most often quoted example of that is Black Saturday in Victoria. It was about 150, 160 people died directly from the fires. But it was some hundreds of people, about 450 people, who were estimated to die from a consequence of that extraordinary heat. This summer, of course, saw us breaking records all over the place, with both minimum and maximum temperatures increased across many parts of Australia. It's worth defining a heat wave, and again, the interesting aspect of heat waves is that I think that they've changed, and it's partly perhaps drawing on what Robert and Mark have commented, that we're not just seeing a linear change in our temperature and in our environment, but things are beginning to accelerate. So a heat wave's been defined quite elegantly by the Bureau of Meteorology. 3 days of higher than usual temperatures, and they take into consideration both high temperatures during the day, but that loss of overnight cooling, as those of us who were in Canberra recently might recollect, also has profound effects on our health. And so it takes into consideration both of those. These numbers of heat waves are increasing over the last couple of years and decades. And what's really struck me last summer was I began to become obsessed by the potential relationship between heat and the way that we age, particularly when our heat wave didn't last for 2 or 3 days of being able to lie on the couch. But there were 3 weeks from mid-January through to early February where exercise restriction was a common piece of medical advice. And so our heat waves are lasting for longer and of higher intensity. And that has significant flow-on effects to our health. So what sort of effects do we see from heat? Well, it's uncomfortable, often will become a little more irritable, me particularly. Dehydration, we recognise that we'll become dehydrated under hot circumstances, and it's a combination of these factors that will lead to an increase in the risk of renal impairment or kidney failure, and it's an additive risk if you're working outside. So if you're using your muscle and you're dehydrated and it's hot, the likelihood of renal impairment goes up. High temperatures can cause confusion and delirium and a representation for the elderly, and in fact for any of us. Heart failure can be precipitated by very high temperatures, by dehydration and by heat stress. And heat stroke, of course, has quite a high mortality. The morbidity and mortality rises with severity of heat waves, and the vulnerable population. This is a dominant theme when we think about climate change and health. the vulnerable population, those who are older, who have pre-morbid health conditions, and those who are very young. And young people, very small children, are particularly prone to dehydration because of their high body mass index or their body surface area. This is a really elegant chart from Todd Kellstrom, who's now in New Zealand, who has spent some time here at A&M as well, which just takes us through the way in which we might think about heat. It's not just about the physiology of those hot, uncomfortable days, but there's two pathways through here. Firstly, there's two ways in which you get hot. There's the external environment, and then there's also internal heat production. So if you're working hard in a hot environment, that has an additive effect. And so there's one pathway which describes those physiological effects leading to injury to kidneys, leading to injuries to heart, injuries to skeletal muscle, and having a negative impact on the individual. But there are broader social problems associated with higher temperatures. And so we know that agricultural productivity is influenced by high temperatures, but it's also our capacity to work is adversely impacted under hot temperatures. So we know that high temperatures will diminish our physical capacity to work, it changes our concentration, our memory, even in the office environment, in an academic environment, our productivity is reduced. And so this has both negative impacts on the population health and negative impacts on the broader community, including from an economic perspective. So we should take this stuff quite seriously. I think some of the takeaway messages from this are that there's an increased risk of chronic renal disease, particularly in people working outside. There may be a relationship with the development of type 2 diabetes. There is an inverse relationship between productivity and heat. And we know there's a relationship between domestic violence and particularly loss of nighttime cooling. And so, again, it's a really important social issue. Changes to our concentration, changes to academic performance, changes to productivity are all things that we're going to need to build into our lives going forward from now. That's heat. Fire. I've only got one quick slide about fire because I want to talk a little bit about smoke. But the fires that we've had this year were quite remarkable. And I'd be surprised if there was someone in the room who had not been affected in some way by the events that took place on the south coast. That photograph is where my family were on New Year's Eve. It's just out of Eden in a place called Edron. It's near that wood chip mill that went up in flames a few days later. So I think that photo was taken in the middle of the day with that really extraordinarily ominous sky. So these fires were remarkable, weren't they? We've had months of below average rainfall, we had above average temperatures, we had fire extending from southern Queensland all the way down the coast. And I've begun to think about this as a transformative fire. It's an ecosystem which has changed. This fire risk affected millions of Australians. It's extraordinary that I think that number is 33. 33 people died directly from the exposure to fire, but there were some thousands of structures burnt. We lost 18 million hectares of land. The number of animals, it's hard to imagine what that number actually is. We know it's very, very high. Lives have been disrupted, livelihoods have been lost, towns have been destroyed, aesthetics have altered, and the flow-on effects from that, we know from previous analysis looking at events such as Black Saturday in Victoria, is that the mental and long-term health effects of that resonate for many years. This is smoke, and I was working at Canberra Hospital in that end of December, early January period, and I took photos out the window of the 7th floor on a few occasions. And so that's a smattering of the sort of air pollution we had over Canberra in that first 2 weeks of this year. And it went from lightly hazy through to we can't see the building, the end of the building. On those days where our PM2.5 levels really smashed global records. So bushfire smoke, you've probably all heard about it, it's been in the media a bit. Again, it'll be a common experience in the room. You will understand that really hazardous levels of bushfire smoke and air pollution causes minor irritation to your eyes, it can cause a sore throat, it can make you cough. There's an immunological response, there's a pneumonitis or an inflammation of the lung, which is precipitated by that really high levels of PM2.5 and high levels of smoke exposure. And for any of us who were in Canberra over that period, we've probably experienced it. It resolves, it gets better. We don't think it's got long-term consequences, but we'll understand more soon. Serious breathing problems were much less common. We probably didn't see the spike in emergency department presentations that we predicted if you're looking out the window. But certainly the anecdotes from general practice is that there were a tremendous number of people presenting with minor problems with breathing. So undiagnosed asthma presenting with a little bit more short of breath and a cough. PM2.5 received a lot of attention. bushfire smoke, and it's a big part of the bushfire smoke pollution. And it's a problem particularly because these very small particles cross into the bloodstream, and that changes our immune system response, increasing the likelihood of infection. So things like urinary tract infections, cellulitis, chest infections are made more likely by the hazardous air quality that we had over that period. Equally, there's an increase in vascular events, heart attack and stroke, and arrhythmias, cardiovascular events. There are mental health effects of smoke. I don't know if anyone in the room would like to disagree with that, but again, if this is the lived experience where we all know that those weeks of the sky being orange, the aesthetic is unusual, the temperatures are high, and there's a slightly ominous sense of doom, that affects our mental health and well-being, it affects our outlook, and it really comes back to our individual and our capacity, resilience and our capacity to work together as to how well we will recover. That word unprecedented, is it overused? This summer has not happened before. There aren't textbook examples of a summer where bushfire smoke and bushfires of this magnitude have occurred. And so we don't know in the medical literature what the long-term effects of this event are, and we're hoping to learn more. I wish we didn't need to. I'm a cardiologist, it's impossible not to talk about exercise, so I wanted to talk just quickly about exercise and climate change, because I think that's one of the really easy mechanisms by which we will see climate change already affecting our health. The benefits of exercise are tremendous. You know that it affects our well-being, from our mental health and well-being, our concentration. It's a great form of resilience against the cognitive impairment. It's good for blood pressure, it's good for diabetes, it's good to reduce your risk of falling over. It just makes you feel better. And so heat, smoke, fire, drought, the loss of biodiversity, the solastalgia, that sense of grief that you feel when you look at the changed environment, all of those things change our exercise routine. And that has follow-on effects. So that means that it's not just the acute events of summer which have potentially compromised our health, but it's the flow-on effects as we try to recover both physically and psychologically from an extraordinary series of events. I think mental health and climate change warranted a quick discussion. I'm not a psychiatrist, but again, I've commented on the fact that I think the distress associated with this summer has been very real. Loss of livelihoods, loss of property, loss of life, loss of the areas in which we enjoy relaxation. That loss of summer for many of us. And I know we all have a complete awareness that this has no magnitude in contrast to the loss of life and having lost a house. But that loss of summer, again, will resonate in our health through our community for the rest of this year and beyond. So I think we should acknowledge that we lost our summer. That eco-anxiety terminology, I think, will grow. I had a few takeaway points from Black Summer. I'm not sure, Kate, whether I got the hashtag right, but I called it Black Summer. It's Red Summer, it's got all sorts of different names. It was an extraordinary, unprecedented event. It's part of our rapidly changing climate. I'm borrowing and paraphrasing Mark Howden badly that we must discuss this as a rapidity of change, that things are getting rapidly changing in a rapid way, and that we're not settling into new normal, as it's often presented to us. This will continue to get worse. Extreme events that previously lasted for short periods are now lasting for longer periods. The additive risk, and this is drawing a little bit on what Robert's been speaking about, the cascading, compounding effects, that it's not just smoke, but it was the smoke and the really high temperatures which had a potential impact on our health. And who particularly has that additive effect? The vulnerable populations. So people who are at risk from hazardous air quality are also at risk from those high temperatures, and those risks are almost certainly additive. Health impacts from climate change are broad. They're seen all through all different elements of medicine and our health and well-being. And the population affected in Australia this summer has to be 15 million people or more. There's 15 million or so people exposed to hazardous air pollution at some point. So the population effect is ginormous. Predicting and preparing for events like this might help. And imagination and collaboration is something that I would join in the call for. I think Mark was talking about the need for imagination. But we really need to work together on this. And I was speaking with Sophie Lewis about this back in January. Sophie and I have been speaking about the potential challenges of the summer. I've been spending time thinking about how to prepare better for heat and how to prepare our population health response from heat. And Sophie obviously is an extraordinary climate scientist. We both knew there was a tremendous risk of fire, and yet very few of us predicted smoke as a problem. I do think if we'd sat in a room together, so if we called it a summit, let's say, in June last year, and we had environmental scientists and doctors, climate scientists, government people at a desk together, and we talked about the potential risks from summer, that topic of conversation would have been raised. We would have talked about the potential for a large population effect from hazardous bushfire smoke, and we would have been better prepared. And so I think that's one of the really significant take-home messages from me from this summer, is how do we foster that cross-disciplinary collaboration which will help us to be better prepared for the next one. Health is a really important argument in action on climate change, and I would hope that some of what I've given you today equips you in further discussions with friends, families, policymakers, etc. on the politics of climate change. Because I wanted to finish, having started with the negative, we'll end with the positive. Climate change is completely recognised as the greatest health opportunity in global health for the 21st century. Why? The synergies of benefit action are most obvious when we look at the health impacts of things like moving towards active transport and making a nutritional transition, fostering community resilience and working together. That will improve our health and well-being, and I think is a really powerful argument.